Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at bitesizedbiographies.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of part one of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, Edward Snowden, American hero or malignant traitor. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige. Please note that all of Bite-Sized Biographies are now available on Spotify. And please tell a friend about my podcast. And now let's get started with our story about Edward Snowden. In December of 2012, a journalist and blogger named Glenn Greenwald received an unsolicited email from an anonymous source. It simply stated, "I have some stuff you might be interested in." For Greenwald, a high-profile political gadfly and media celebrity, this was not unusual. But the potential source did have an unusual request, that Greenwald install encryption software on his computer to allow confidential digital exchanges. Initially, Greenwald ignored the request and subsequent attempts to get him to install the software and respond meaningfully. The source then tried a different approach. In January of 2013, he sent an email to documentary filmmaker Laura Poitras. Poitras was an Oscar-nominated documentarian who had already produced two controversial films about American foreign policy in Iraq and Afghanistan. So controversial, in fact, that upon entering the U.S. from international destinations, she was routinely stopped and questioned by U.S. government officials and also placed on an official Department of Homeland Security watch list. These travails were discussed publicly by Greenwald, and the potential source assumed that the two were familiar with each other. Unlike Greenwald, Poitras was immediately responsive, especially upon hearing that the individual contacting her was a senior member of the intelligence community. "This won't be a waste of your time." Unlike Greenwald, who eventually admitted that one of the reasons he did not respond was his lack of technological sophistication, Poitras was, by necessity, quite familiar with confidential digital communication processes. To her assertion that she did not know whether the potential source was legit, crazy, or trying to entrap me, he responded, "I'm not going to ask you anything. I'm just going to tell you things." By 2013, Poitras was so concerned with American harassment that she had relocated to Berlin. After receiving additional emails that discussed the potential leak of bombshell information about illegal American government cyber eavesdropping, as well as the personal motivation for doing so, Poitras resolved to involve Greenwald. Understanding that any traditional communication she undertook would probably be reviewed by U.S. intelligence agencies, she contacted Greenwald and requested they meet personally in New York. Greenwald lived in Brazil, the result of his same-sex marriage, which, at the time it occurred, was not recognized in the United States. In early 2013, the two met in New York City, where Greenwald was speaking at a conference, and his presence would not arouse suspicion. He agreed to collaborate, but emphasized that without documents that indicated egregious illegal U.S. government behavior, there would not be much interest. Still skeptical that the source would amount to much of anything, Greenwald returned to Brazil and Poitras to Berlin. But he did finally install encryption software provided by Poitras. Soon afterwards, the source was in direct contact, providing Greenwald with specifics of interaction between the NSA and America's largest internet concerns, a program known as PRISM. Eventually, this individual provided additional information, extraordinary material that was obviously authentic and indicated that the NSA had possibly lied and definitely misled Congress concerning domestic eavesdropping activities. The contact then suggested a face-to-face meeting to provide even more material. Poitras requested that she be able to film the interaction, a request she assumed would probably be denied, and even if it took place, would definitely require the concealment of the source's actual identity. Surprisingly, the source not only agreed to filming, he even encouraged her to make his identity public, acknowledging that this would make him subject to arrest and lengthy incarceration. He sent detailed information on where, how, and when they, Greenwald, Poitras, and the source would meet. Mysteriously, the location of the meeting was a small luxury hotel in Hong Kong. In these latter negotiations, after Greenwald spoke with his editors at his current freelance employer, the UK Guardian newspaper, and got their agreement to sponsor this interaction, and Poitras also made arrangements to participate, a third individual, a senior Guardian editor, was also included in the mix. By the time this trio boarded an airplane for Hong Kong, they also had a name for their contact, Edward Snowden. At the time, this name, which they did not even Google for fear that it would alert some intelligence agency, meant nothing to any of them. But in the weeks, months, and even years to come, Edward Snowden would be the latest on a short list of prominent whistleblowers like the Pentagon Papers' Daniel Ellsberg and Mark Felt of Watergate Deep Throat fame that rocked the U.S. defense and political establishments to their very core. Edward Snowden was born on June 21, 1983, in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. His father, Lonnie, who had an engineering background, spent his entire career with the U.S. Coast Guard. His mother was also employed by the U.S. government in various positions, including the National Security Agency, and eventually was employed in the federal district court system. Both had top-secret clearances, which related to their employment. Snowden, who was rumored to have scored 145 on 2 separate IQ tests, was certainly highly intelligent, but had an erratic academic record from an early age. When he was 9, his parents moved to Crofton, Maryland. Disinterested in schoolwork, Snowden became practically obsessed with computers from the moment his father introduced a desktop to the household. He spent as much time as possible on the device, playing various computer games, but also spending hours entranced by the internet itself. Snowden also was immediately fascinated by the practice of hacking, but initially focused on rather innocent methods of improving his performance in various computer games as opposed to anything nefarious. He eventually graduated to accessing restricted files at such locations as the U.S. Nuclear Research Laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico. But even this behavior was followed up with a sincere effort to inform the IT department of its security vulnerability. Snowden's parents divorced when he was in high school, an event that only added to his social isolation and even alienation from his peers. During his sophomore year, he also developed mononucleosis, and informed by his high school that he would have to repeat the grade, Snowden was galvanized into devising an alternative. He applied and was accepted at a local college, the Anne Arundel Community College, and offered participation in the school's coursework as an alternative to repeating a year and probably bypassing the rest of high school altogether. Known as problematic for his habit of sleeping through most of his classes and pronounced aversion to academics, his high school administrators were only too willing to allow this diversion, figuring that Snowden would no longer be their responsibility. By his mid-teens, Snowden was essentially self-sufficient, living with his mother, who between work and a renewed social life following her divorce was frequently out of their condo home. Snowden, younger than most of his community college counterparts, did manage to make friends, especially within a group of individuals who were enrolled in a class concerning learning basic Japanese. One of these fellow students also ran a small graphic design business, and employed Snowden as a freelance web designer, the teenager already proficient enough to handle such a responsibility. He took classes at Johns Hopkins to pass a Microsoft Certified Systems Engineer exam and claimed at some point to have received a GED, although a subsequent congressional investigation indicated that this assertion was unverifiable and possibly untrue. Like many Americans, Edward Snowden was deeply affected by the events of 9/11, especially as the son of two federal employees and a resident of the D.C. area. Ultimately, despite the deep misgivings of his mother, and without even really discussing it with his father, he enlisted in the Army. Initially, based on preliminary testing, he was designated for potential Special Forces training, with a focus on an involvement utilizing his language and technical skills. Unfortunately, his Army enlistment came to a halt when, during basic training at Fort Benning, he suffered stress fractures in both of his legs, and within a matter of weeks received an administrative separation, neither an honorable or dishonorable discharge. Although a disappointment at the time, Snowden's brief enlistment made him reevaluate whether he truly wanted to be in the military, and he ultimately decided that his real future and abilities were much more suited to a career involving computer technology. He completed a background examination and received security clearances that allowed him to apply for various technical positions, both in the public and private sector, winding up initially as essentially a security guard at an NSA-sponsored program called the Center for the Advanced Study of Language. Snowden literally spent much of his after-hours shifts patrolling an empty building, still under construction, not the most desirable of positions. But at least there was plenty of free time to find another, better job. That process didn't take long. Both federal intelligence agencies and the consulting firms that routinely contracted with them aggressively trying to find younger employees with the requisite technical skills to keep up with the ever-expanding cyber technology demands of national security. Snowden encountered a fairly typical process. He was officially hired by a subcontractor retained by an even larger British aerospace firm contractor to hire employees to work at the CIA. This Byzantine system was constructed to bypass lugubrious governmental processes and funding requirements of the federal government, and it worked well enough for everyone but the taxpayer, as it allowed a governmental agency to circumvent any budgetary constraints. Not that the CIA or any U.S. intelligence agency had much of that in any case. Snowden worked the night shift again from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. 3 days in a row with 2 days off as a systems administrator within a team that ensured that the agency's systems were functioning properly and to assist in the event of any technical issue, ranging from the minor to the catastrophic. During this time period, the headquarters location he worked in was running with a skeleton crew of techies and very little else, quiet and empty. Snowden worked with an experienced individual in any case, and the job was not particularly demanding, with zero oversight and a great deal of free time. Unlike his co-workers, who spent much of the shift goofing off with a novel or in the agency gym, Snowden satisfied his voracious appetite for searching the internet and CIA intranet, which was an endless source of important information. As part of the CIA computer security system included stringent controls, he couldn't get too far out of bounds, but he was able to read internal news sites with international updates on significant events unfolding all over the world. Snowden had no desire at such a young age to spend his career as an overpaid, technically savvy, but unchallenged night shift administrator. Within a year, he found a new position that actually was officially designated as within the CIA, and with this an eventual assignment to an embassy somewhere in the world, and undercover status as a highly trained technical jack of all trades on site to ensure the smooth operation of the technology infrastructure. Obviously, it would not do to have some external foreign national repairman working on any technical issues that typically occurred amidst the local digital infrastructure. Even during the initial 6-month training period, Snowden became involved in a minor incident when, as the ringleader of his trainee class, he complained several times about the lousy conditions in their motel residence, a decrepit Comfort Inn, even circumventing the chain of command. Although this situation got rectified, Snowden received a strange kind of retribution when, during the process where a trainee requests a field position location and Snowden indicated a preference for combat theater assignment in Afghanistan, instead he was assigned to the much more civilized and sought-after post of Geneva. Snowden's subsequent memoir describes his stint in Geneva as uneventful, save for the luxury of a spacious apartment paid for by the embassy, and the company of his longtime serious girlfriend, Lindsay Mills, who came over from the States. According to a subsequent summary by the House Intelligence Committee, Snowden's tenure in Switzerland was problematic, with several run-ins with superiors and 6 counseling sessions in a 6-month period between October 2007 and April 2008. Later that year, he requested that he be transferred back to the States before his assignment officially ran out, a request that was denied. He and his girlfriend returned to the D.C. area in any case for what he claimed were medical appointments for both of them. Subsequently, he was told not to return to Geneva. Snowden doesn't really give a reason in his memoir for leaving the CIA. In fact, he only mentioned that he got a new position in Japan with the NSA, a contracting job through, again, a corporate smokescreen, Perot Systems. Perot Systems was eventually acquired by Dell, and so officially Snowden was employed by this entity, despite the fact that he worked at the NSA's Pacific Technical Center at the massive Yokota Air Base near Tokyo. Once again, his girlfriend Lindsay would join him. This transfer was accomplished despite Snowden's repeated personnel issues while at the CIA. Apparently, he stayed ahead of any official documentation entered into his employment file, or his new contractor and the NSA failed to review his previous employment specifics. Such was the appetite for any kind of highly skilled cyber technology employees. It was during this time period that Edward Snowden would become more familiar with some of the controversial NSA enterprises implemented during the Bush administration, most notably the President's Surveillance Program. The PSP, as it was known, granted the NSA the power to gather both internet and telephonic communications between the U.S. and international locations, and to do this without getting a warrant from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, a court implemented after the abuses of various intelligence agencies during the post-Watergate era came to light. The rationale was that the U.S. was at war, the ubiquitous war on terror, and thus in wartime, the president was granted such powers, a tenuous legal perspective that became controversial. This circumvention ultimately was revealed by national media, and while the Bush administration claimed to have discontinued the program, actually it remained in place, the Obama administration refusing to legally hold anyone accountable or to even implement a congressional investigation. Although Snowden had never been particularly political, he, and especially his girlfriend, had high hopes that the incoming Obama administration would introduce a wholesale philosophical change to the operation of government, to a more ethical and transparent process, especially in the law enforcement and intelligence agency departments. Because it was part of Snowden's job description to identify and ensure that highly classified documents were appropriately stored and secured, he routinely had access to such documents, and unlike most of his counterparts, instead of a cursory review, he read them in full. He eventually read about a program codenamed Stellar Wind, which, implemented in 2001, was the NSA's initial foray not into targeted surveillance of individual communications, but the implementation of what was called bulk collection, a typically sanitized governmental euphemism for mass surveillance, and despite the Bush administration's legal machinations for the rest of his term in office, behavior that was controversial, if not outright illegal. It was this ultimate revelation that the Obama administration was to proceed without any fundamental changes within the intelligence community that sent Snowden on the ultimate path that he pursued. The congressional investigation of Snowden's CV indicates that he returned to the United States in September of 2010, still employed by Dell, who was intent on placing him within the IT operations at the CIA. But this time, the CIA balked. At least one derogatory report in his permanent record indicating that he should not be granted the appropriate clearances. Dell placed him on leave for several months before he was hired in December 2010 into a position as a technical backup for a team marketing position that sold Dell's technical capabilities. In Snowden's account of his efforts with his sales point man, the process involved promising CIA purchasing agents the world, especially when it came to potentially constructing the latest rage in the tech world, cloud computing. Snowden lasted in this role officially until August 31st, 2011, his congressional investigators merely noting that he took a leave of absence from Dell that lasted until January 12, 2012. Snowden's memoir indicates a much more traumatic reason for this leave, the onset of epilepsy and seizures which required medication, bed rest, and prevented productivity of any kind. Interestingly, during his description of this aspect of his employment, he described himself as the top technologist for Dell's CIA account, a description that was ultimately a bone of contention, but also provocative in light of the agency's refusal to grant him access and clearances. Snowden gives no explanation as to how his illness resolved itself or what specifically led to his departure from his latest Dell assignment. In his memoir, he merely fast-forwarded to early 2012 and his new position, still working officially for Dell, but now in Hawaii, back with the NSA as a systems administrator at the agency's Hawaii Cryptologic Center, a location involved in communications interception and cybersecurity, mostly against China and North Korea. He merely mentions that his doctors told him that the weather would help with minimizing his sleeplessness and seizures. Snowden's political leanings were underlined by two separate $250 campaign contributions to Ron Paul, presidential candidate and staunch libertarian. Lindsay Mills also joined him and immediately took to her new environment, interacting with a dance troupe and other bohemians, but also did not seem to have employment of any kind. Although Snowden later claimed that his final impetus to actually begin electronically removing sensitive NSA files was the March 2013 dishonest congressional testimony of Director of National Intelligence's James Clapper, who, when asked directly if U.S. intelligence engaged in illegal surveillance, replied to Oregon Senator Ron Wyden, quote, "No, sir, not wittingly," unquote. It is clear that Snowden began hoarding documents months before that date. As he had in previous assignments, in June of 2012, Snowden also got entangled in a disagreement with his supervisors that again involved him attempting to circumvent direct supervision after he was reprimanded about a technical mishap which caused a system failure. In the ensuing dust-up, he included actual government supervisors at the NSA, external from his consulting supervisory chain of command, a seriously egregious affront to his direct supervisors. For this, he would be officially reprimanded, a reprimand that prompted him to acknowledge in a subsequent email that his handling of the matter was inappropriate. One wonders if Snowden's contrition was the result of him realizing that having a reputation as a renegade would only attract scrutiny to his activities, both licit and illicit. It was only weeks later, on July 12, 2012, that he began to download large quantities of highly classified documents onto his own personal network drive. Snowden also was able to get coworkers to unwittingly cooperate with him by giving him password access to information that he normally would not have been able to download. He obtained additional unauthorized access by using his system knowledge to access loopholes in various NSA security firewalls, allowing him to acquire even more material. It was in December of 2012 that Snowden reached out to journalist Glenn Greenwald. Although his initial attempts to interest the journalist were unsuccessful, he also continued to implement methods that allowed him even greater access to classified information. He went as far as to apply for a regular NSA position and actually was successful in getting a job offer, but he turned it down based on the low salary. In March of 2013, he was hired by Booz Allen Hamilton, and after several weeks of training on the mainland, he returned to Hawaii and even greater access to intelligence agency information. Only weeks later, he explained to his supervisors that he felt ill again and requested a brief leave of absence, although Snowden was never asked for and never provided any medical documentation of his alleged epilepsy. His leave began on May 15th, and on May 19th, 2013, without telling his girlfriend, who left at the same time on a camping trip to Kauai, or mother, who was actually in Hawaii at the time visiting, he flew to Hong Kong. It is believed that Snowden deliberately planned to have his mother in Hawaii so that when the inevitable media firestorm ensued, mother and daughter-in-law would be able to lean on each other. Later, he would also explain that he believed Hong Kong was an international sanctuary for free speech. He also made the decision to bypass traditional print media, namely the New York Times, as the Times had, as a courtesy to the Bush administration, initially supplied an article written by journalist James Risen concerning aspects of the Stellar Wind eavesdropping program. Officials within the Bush administration responded by pressuring the Times and claiming such information was classified and would also weaken the war on terror. In the end, the Times editor-in-chief and his publisher caved, and the article did not run. Snowden was afraid that if the Times or any other traditional media outlet acted in a similar fashion, he could be prosecuted without his information ever reaching the public. Snowden always maintained that he fully intended to be apprehended at some point. His true fear was that this would occur before his cache of revelatory information ever made it into the public domain. Snowden checked into the Mira Hotel, a smaller boutique hotel in a congested business district where he felt he could remain just another anonymous nobody. He then locked himself in his room and began to sweat out whether or not his media contacts, Poitras and Greenwald, would get to Hong Kong before his official leave of absence ran out. Once that happened, not only would Booz Allen Hamilton come looking for him, they were mandated to notify the NSA of his disappearance, and the agency would begin a much more thorough investigation. Poitras, even after she heard of the potential Hong Kong meeting place, was still eager to pursue a face-to-face meeting, but she would not do it alone. It was Greenwald who still did not understand exactly what his potential source was offering. As the clock ticked down, Greenwald flew to New York to not only meet with Poitras, but also to discuss the situation with the UK Guardian's New York editors. His editors felt that only a face-to-face meeting could verify the legitimacy of the contact, and they also insisted that a third person be a part of the team, Ewan MacAskill, a 61-year-old Scot, who was also the paper's Washington correspondent. After Poitras hand-delivered a thumb drive containing more specific, top-secret, and potentially explosive information on Stellar Wind to Greenwald, and Poitras accepted the presence of MacAskill, who she felt mistakenly might be some kind of corporate senior babysitter who might attempt to impose restrictions, the trio then flew to Hong Kong, arriving there on Sunday, June 2nd. Snowden was already on edge, as he knew that his official leave of absence had ended on Friday, May 31st. Although he could not know it, Booz Allen did not even attempt to contact him until Monday, June 3rd. His girlfriend Lindsay was of little use to Snowden's employer, as upon her return the only acknowledgement of his absence was a note that simply stated, "Got called away for work. I love you," Snowden signing it with the name Echo. If his absence and complete lack of information as to where he was or when or even if he would return was devastating, Snowden knew that to keep her completely in the dark would not only help her during the inevitable interrogation, but his difficult but sensible decision to never discuss either his specific issues at work, his clandestine document theft, or plan to illegally leak sensitive information would actually prevent her from complicity in a crime. Upon landing in Hong Kong, Greenwald and Poitras got in touch by encrypted computer message, and Snowden advised them to wait until Monday morning to meet with him in his hotel. Greenwald and Poitras basically told McCaskill, who had flown in with them on the same plane, that they would initially attempt to meet up with their contact by themselves, telling him that they would size Snowden up first to see if he was legitimate. They also did not want to spook Snowden with some unknown third person before they were able to at least establish some rapport on their own. After a very intricate set of directions, Poitras and Greenwald were able to establish contact. The key element in this process, Snowden's identifier of a Rubik's Cube that he held in his hand. Greenwald was immediately shocked by Snowden's youthful appearance. Although the whistleblower was 29, he appeared even younger and was dressed in a casual white t-shirt, faded jeans, a modest attempt at a goatee, trendy but still nerdy glasses, thin and very pale. A standard-issue 21st century computer geek, not the grizzled intelligence veteran motivated by decades of government agency bureaucratic dysfunction and political alienation that Greenwald expected. His appearance was so jarring to Greenwald that initially he wondered, as Snowden conveyed them both to what he said was his hotel room, if Snowden was in fact some kind of go-between, or even worse, a complete imposter. That such a young person would have gained access to the tranche of incredibly sensitive materials Snowden had already presented seemed almost too good to believe. But he and Poitras followed until they arrived at room 1014. Snowden used his electronic key card to let them into a nice but still very small hotel room that was littered with stacks of room service trays, plates, uneaten food, and laundry tossed on the bed and even on the floor. He immediately apologized, explaining that he had spent most of the last 2 weeks in this room, only leaving it briefly on a few occasions, and expressly forbidding housekeeping. The trio sat down, Snowden on the bed, quickly establishing whether Greenwald had a cell phone. He explained that U.S. intelligence had the capability to turn any cell phone into a listening device, and advised Greenwald that it would be best if the journalist stored it in the refrigerator. Greenwald complied, but this off-the-wall request only added to his speculation as to who and what he was actually dealing with. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this podcast about Edward Snowden. Information for this podcast came from the books Permanent Record by Edward Snowden, The Snowden Files by Luke Harding, and Nowhere to Hide by Glenn Greenwald. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical and musical information at bitesizebiographies.com. Thank you for listening, and please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies.